December 11, 1941. Franklin D. Roosevelt sat in the Oval Office, staring at the morning telegram from Berlin. Hitler had just declared war on the United States, following Pearl Harbor and the American declaration against Japan. Roosevelt had prepared for months, yet the reality hit differently. This was no longer a Pacific conflict alone. The war had arrived at America's doorstep in Europe as well. Roosevelt's eyes moved over the map of Europe. Germany's armies were vast, disciplined, and experienced. The Nazi war machine had conquered Poland, France, Norway, the Low Countries. And now, Hitler sought to bring America fully into the European theater. Roosevelt understood the stakes immediately. This was no longer about aiding allies or sending supplies. This was about total war, about every American resource and life being mobilized to face the most formidable enemy the world had ever seen. He turned to his advisors, his cabinet, the military chiefs who had waited in tense silence. Roosevelt's voice was calm, even measured, but it carried the weight of history. "This is the moment we've feared," he said. "But it is also the moment we have been preparing for. The United States will not shrink from its responsibility. Hitler has made his decision. So shall we." Behind his calm words, Roosevelt felt the gravity of what was to come. The nation was untested in a war of this scale. The army was small compared to the German Wehrmacht. The Navy and Air Force were strong but stretched across the Pacific and Atlantic. Factories had been gearing up but not yet at full capacity. The American people would need to be mobilized not just physically, but morally. And Roosevelt knew this speech, this message to Congress, would mark the turning point in American resolve. Roosevelt drafted his address to Congress with precision. Every word mattered. Every pause, every phrase, every emphasis. He would speak not only to lawmakers but to the millions of Americans listening on their radios. He needed them to understand the danger, yes, but also to feel the confidence that their nation could meet it. He reread the sentence that would open the speech. "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked." That line had been written for Pearl Harbor, but now, in light of Hitler's declaration, it resonated on a global scale. Roosevelt made small adjustments. He would frame this not as vengeance but as duty. He would invoke the Constitution, the honor of the nation, the memory of past sacrifices, and the promise to future generations. This was more than a war speech. It was a call to mobilize a continent. When he walked into the House of Representatives, the chamber was packed, tension hanging thick in the air. Members of Congress whispered among themselves, casting worried glances at one another. Some were unprepared for the magnitude of Germany's declaration. Others felt the surge of resolve. Roosevelt paused at the podium, looked out over the assembly, and took a deep breath. Then he began. "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. The United States was also declared war upon by Germany. This day marks the end of isolation. It marks the moment America steps fully into the struggle for freedom and civilization itself." The chamber was silent. Roosevelt's voice was steady, commanding, almost theatrical. He spoke not only to legislators but to the nation listening at home. His words painted a picture of the challenge ahead. Hitler's forces sweeping through Europe, the Axis, expansion into Africa and Asia, the threat to global trade and democracy. Yet for all the gravity, he injected hope. He framed American strength not in past victories, but in potential, industrial might, skilled manpower, and the indomitable spirit of the people. He described the logistical task before them. Factories would shift to produce ships, planes, tanks, weapons. Men and women across the country would take jobs in war production. Rationing would come. Families would sacrifice. But every sacrifice would be for survival, for liberty, for future generations. Roosevelt's words were precise, almost surgical, balancing fear with determination, warning with inspiration. Then came the emotional core. Roosevelt spoke of unity, of standing together against tyranny, of honoring those who had fallen at Pearl Harbor and now facing the wider threat of Germany and Italy. He reminded Congress and America that their allies had fought alone for years. Britain, the Soviet Union, China, nations already bloodied by war, now needed America's full engagement. Roosevelt's speech continued for an hour. Every word was crafted to inspire action and calm fear. He concluded with a pledge. The United States would defend freedom and democracy with every resource, every soldier, every ship, every plane. There would be no turning back. The war would be long, hard, and costly, but the nation would endure and ultimately prevail. Outside, reporters scribbled furiously. Radio broadcasters prepared to relay the speech across the country. Millions of Americans would hear Roosevelt's words that day and understand the magnitude of what lay ahead. The president returned to the Oval Office afterward, exhausted but resolute. He had given the nation its orders and the world its warning. America was fully in the war against Hitler and the Axis powers. In the following weeks, Roosevelt oversaw the rapid mobilization of industry and military. Shipyards buzzed with activity, aircraft factories ran day and night, recruitment offices filled with volunteers. Yet Roosevelt also understood morale was key. He addressed the people in radio broadcasts, offering reassurance, clarity, and determination. "We will not falter. We will not fail," he said, repeating phrases for emphasis, for confidence, for unity. Meanwhile in Europe, German generals received news that America had declared war. They were shocked not at Pearl Harbor but at the Atlantic front opening. Hitler had miscalculated. He assumed American involvement would be delayed, hesitant. Instead, Roosevelt's declaration signaled full engagement. The combined industrial might of the United States, fresh soldiers, air power, naval forces. The scale of what Germany faced had changed overnight. By mid-December, American forces were already preparing for deployment to Europe and North Africa. Roosevelt coordinated with Churchill, exchanging strategies via telegrams and conferences. His leadership combined vision with practical action. The Allies now had a commander whose words inspired both civilians and soldiers alike. The reality of America entering the war was now tangible, visible, unstoppable. Roosevelt's message also reached the Japanese. Tokyo realized that Germany's declaration had brought the full force of the United States to bear. Coordination between Axis powers was strained. Hitler had overestimated Japan's ability to hold the Pacific, while America poured resources into both theaters. Roosevelt had transformed the conflict into a truly global war. As the year drew to a close, Roosevelt reflected privately. The nation faced immense challenges, but he had faith in American resilience. Factories, troops, and ships were mobilizing. Citizens were uniting behind a common cause. The military planners were strategizing, mapping out the campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. Roosevelt knew this would be a long struggle, perhaps the longest the nation had ever faced. Yet the moral clarity of their purpose and the strength of American resources gave him confidence. In January 1942, Roosevelt called for a unified command structure with Britain. Lend-Lease shipments accelerated. Training camps for troops expanded. Naval convoys increased patrols in the Atlantic. Every decision reflected one truth: the United States would fight a two-ocean war. Roosevelt's rhetoric and action merged seamlessly, setting the tone for the next 4 years of global conflict. By spring, Roosevelt had cemented the image of America as the arsenal and shield of freedom. He visited factories, spoke over the radio, toured military installations, and coordinated with allies. The president's leadership style, calm yet firm, inspirational yet analytical, kept the nation focused. Americans were preparing not only to defend themselves, but to project power overseas. Roosevelt's vision was clear. Germany and Japan would face the full weight of a mobilized United States, and defeat was inevitable. The speech, the mobilization, the coordination with allies, all culminated in the realization that America's entry was decisive. The war's momentum shifted. Roosevelt had achieved what no other event could. He had transformed the fear and grief after Pearl Harbor into a collective purpose. He had united a nation, rallied allies, and sent a message to enemies that the United States would fight relentlessly. Roosevelt understood symbolism as Churchill did, but his symbolism was action-oriented. Every ship launched, every soldier trained, every broadcast made was a physical manifestation of resolve. In Washington, the president watched as America prepared for war in a way Europe had never seen. The Atlantic and Pacific theaters would now face a nation mobilized, determined, and guided by a leader who balanced emotion, calculation, and vision. By mid-1942, American forces were arriving in Britain and North Africa. Roosevelt's planning and speeches had set the stage for joint operations with Churchill and Allied commanders. The nation's industrial might was visible, its armies growing, its resolve unshakable. The declaration from Hitler, meant to intimidate, had instead solidified American engagement, and Roosevelt's words, spoken with calm authority, would echo across the globe for the duration of the war. Roosevelt did not stop at speeches. Behind the scenes, he worked tirelessly with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, mapping out logistics for troops, aircraft, and naval deployments. Every port, every airfield, every convoy was scrutinized. He understood that American soldiers marching in Europe and Africa would not only fight, they would symbolize a nation fully engaged. Each decision he made carried both strategic and symbolic weight. As American forces trained in the United States and in British camps, Roosevelt visited installations whenever possible. He watched young men march, handle weapons, and practice maneuvers. He spoke with drill instructors, asked questions about readiness, and emphasized morale. "These men," he said quietly to his aides, "carry the hope of millions. Their preparation must match their spirit." Across the Atlantic, Churchill monitored the buildup with cautious optimism. Roosevelt's decisiveness reassured the British Prime Minister. Letters and telegrams flowed constantly between Washington and London, full of plans, updates, and encouragement. Roosevelt's calm yet authoritative tone reassured Britain. The United States would not falter. The alliance's foundation was now stronger than ever, forged by necessity, mutual respect, and a shared enemy. Meanwhile, Roosevelt kept the American public engaged. Fireside chats became a vital tool. Millions tuned in as he described the realities of war, the need for rationing, the urgency of enlistment, and the importance of national unity. His words were deliberate, motivational, and candid. Americans heard not just what was happening abroad, but what they could do at home to ensure victory. Roosevelt understood the psychological dimension of leadership. He knew that morale at home would influence performance abroad. Factories ran non-stop, women replaced men in essential jobs, and citizens made sacrifices that mirrored those of soldiers overseas. Roosevelt's guidance and presence became a stabilizing force amid the uncertainty of global war. By mid-1942, American troops were arriving in Britain, ready to join the fight. Roosevelt coordinated closely with British military leaders to ensure smooth integration. Training exercises were conducted jointly, and tactics were shared. Roosevelt emphasized collaboration, not dominance, knowing that the success of the Allied operations depended on trust and coordination between nations. Roosevelt also began planning for North Africa. Intelligence reports indicated that Axis forces were overstretched but still formidable. He directed the deployment of armored divisions, air squadrons, and naval support. Every movement was timed to maximize surprise and minimize risk. Roosevelt's strategic vision was clear. America would fight alongside allies, learn from them, and gradually take the lead where necessary. As American soldiers set foot on European soil, Roosevelt reflected on the magnitude of the moment. The nation he led had transformed overnight, from a country at peace to a war machine mobilized on a global scale. His words, speeches, and policies had prepared citizens and troops alike. He understood the responsibility, the danger, and the historical significance of what was unfolding. Across the Atlantic, German leadership grew increasingly concerned. Hitler had underestimated America's industrial capacity, the speed of mobilization, and Roosevelt's leadership. Reports of American production, ship launches, and troop movements arrived daily in Berlin. Hitler realized that his declaration of war had accelerated his own challenges, turning what he assumed would be a distant threat into a direct one. Roosevelt's approach combined pragmatism with vision. While ensuring immediate military readiness, he also considered long-term strategy. Supply lines, joint operations, and international coordination were mapped in detail. Roosevelt's meticulous planning meant that the American war effort would not be reactive, it would be decisive, proactive, and sustained. Domestically, Roosevelt faced political challenges. Isolationist sentiment still lingered in Congress and among the public, yet his speeches and actions gradually unified the nation. Citizens understood that neutrality was no longer possible. Roosevelt's leadership transformed fear into purpose, uncertainty into resolve, and debate into action. In collaboration with Churchill, Roosevelt coordinated the first American deployments to North Africa. Troops, equipment, and supplies moved steadily across the Atlantic, facing U-boat threats and logistical hurdles. Roosevelt monitored progress daily, adjusting plans as necessary. His presence, even from afar, reassured both soldiers and allies that America's involvement was both committed and capable. By late 1942, American air squadrons began operations over Europe, escorting convoys, attacking strategic targets, and supporting British forces. Roosevelt understood that success would not come easily. He prepared the nation for losses, setbacks, and sacrifices while emphasizing the inevitability of eventual victory. His rhetoric balanced realism with inspiration, grounding his people in both facts and faith. Every decision, from mobilization to deployment, carried symbolic weight. Roosevelt recognized that the world was watching. Neutral countries, allies, and enemies alike gauged American commitment by the scale and speed of its actions. His leadership sent a message. The United States had entered the war fully, decisively, and with unwavering resolve. In early 1943, Roosevelt continued visits to military bases, both in the United States and abroad. He observed training exercises, evaluated readiness, and spoke to troops directly. Soldiers reported feeling inspired by his presence. "He makes you understand why we fight," one young sergeant said. "Not just for orders, but for freedom, for the country, for everyone at home and abroad." Roosevelt's coordination with Allied leaders intensified. Joint planning for North Africa and future campaigns in Europe became detailed and precise. He balanced American priorities with Allied needs, ensuring unity of effort. His leadership style, blending strategic calculation, moral authority, and personal presence, became a model for the global alliance. The year 1943 marked the first major American combat operations in Europe under Roosevelt's oversight. Troops landed in North Africa, engaged Axis forces, and began shaping the course of the war. Roosevelt's speeches continued to address the nation, framing each operation in terms of purpose, necessity, and shared sacrifice. The American people followed each development closely, inspired by the clarity and determination of their president. By mid-1943, Roosevelt had transformed the United States from a nation recovering from depression to a fully mobilized global power. His leadership ensured that American soldiers, equipment, and morale reached the front lines efficiently. He balanced strategic foresight with adaptability, adjusting to Axis counterattacks, logistical challenges, and diplomatic concerns. The presence of American troops in Europe signaled a new phase of the war. Roosevelt had made good on his promise. The United States would defend freedom and fight tyranny wherever necessary. His leadership was visible, tangible, and effective. Every operation, every shipment, every speech reinforced the message. America was determined, capable, and fully engaged. In Washington, Roosevelt continued planning for combined operations with British, Canadian, and Free French forces. The complexity of global war required constant coordination. Roosevelt's methodical approach ensured that the Allies could capitalize on their collective strengths, blending experience, resources, and strategy into a cohesive effort. By late 1943, the first American-initiated operations in Europe and North Africa were underway. Roosevelt monitored progress closely, communicating with commanders and allies. His vision of a fully mobilized, capable, and relentless American military was becoming reality. The country's industrial might, citizen engagement, and military preparation all reflected the depth of his planning and leadership. Roosevelt's words, speeches, and actions over the previous year had achieved something remarkable. They transformed American sentiment, mobilized the nation, reassured allies, and signaled to enemies that the United States was fully committed. Hitler's declaration of war had instead catalyzed America's rise to a decisive global role. By early 1944, preparations for the eventual invasion of Western Europe were underway. Roosevelt coordinated with Eisenhower, Marshall, and Allied leaders to plan amphibious assaults, airborne operations, and strategic campaigns. The combined efforts of American and British forces reflected the unity Roosevelt had worked so hard to achieve. The American people, inspired and mobilized, contributed to every aspect of the war effort. Factories produced ships, tanks, and aircraft at unprecedented rates. Citizens rationed, volunteered, and trained. Roosevelt's leadership ensured that this national effort was organized, purposeful, and effective. The United States was no longer a distant participant. It was a decisive force in the fight against Axis powers. Roosevelt's calm authority, visionary leadership, and relentless action ensured that America's entry into the war was complete and irreversible. The stage was set for the Allied push into North Africa, Italy, and eventually France. Hitler's decision to declare war had triggered the mobilization of the world's greatest industrial and military power against him. Roosevelt reflected on the journey from Pearl Harbor to the fully mobilized war effort. Every speech, every action, every decision had contributed to this moment. America was committed, allied with Britain and others, and fully prepared to face the Axis. The war would be long and costly, but Roosevelt's leadership ensured that victory was within reach.